In the spring of 1989, Cincinnati was calm. Children walking home from school, traffic humming through the suburbs, nothing out of place. Then, without warning, 8-year-old vanished somewhere between the classroom door and his front gate. No struggle, no witnesses, no reason. He was there one moment and gone the next. How does a child disappear in the middle of an ordinary day in a neighborhood where everyone knows each other? And if time can hide someone that completely, can it ever give them back? May 1989, Cincinnati, Ohio. It was a mild Friday morning, the kind of day when the air still carried a trace of spring chill before the summer heat began to settle in. The streets of Madisonville were calm. Children in bright backpacks waited at the corners for their school buses, and somewhere down the block, a small house with peeling white paint stood quietly. Inside that house lived a boy named Cole Raymond, 8 years old, 3rd grader at Oak Ridge Elementary. That morning would be the last time anyone in the neighborhood saw him. Cole had lost his father the year before. It was a winter accident on the I-71 bridge, an icy road, a truck that never made it back across the river. His mother, Martha Lynx, had since been working night shifts at Mercy Hospital as a nurse, doing her best to pay rent and keep the lights on. She was not a woman who cried in public. She spoke little and moved quickly, as if staying busy could hold the pieces of her world together. With her schedule and the long hours, she made a decision many single parents had made before. She sent Cole to stay with her sister-in-law, Evelyn Reed, until she could get life back on track. Evelyn lived in a quieter part of town, a 2-story house with trimmed hedges and a patch of grass out front. She was in her 40s, unmarried, worked as a bookkeeper for a small logistics firm, and liked her world neat and predictable. Her house smelled faintly of coffee and furniture polish. Cole brought noise into that order. A boy with endless questions, who talked to the family dog as if it were a classmate, who drew maps of his street with pencil lines that led nowhere. Still, Evelyn grew to like his company. She kept his schedule pinned on the refrigerator. Breakfast at 7, school bus at 7:40, home by 3:30. Every day followed that rhythm, until one didn't. Friday, May 12th. The records say Cole wore a gray checkered shirt, dark jeans, and a pair of new Reebok sneakers, a birthday gift from his mother. Evelyn drove him to the bus stop that morning, just a short distance down the road. A nearby store camera, the kind that recorded on grainy VHS tape, captured them parting ways. Cole waved once, backpack hanging off one shoulder. That was the last image ever taken of him. School ended at 3. Several classmates told police later that Cole mentioned someone would be picking him up. A man in a blue truck, one girl recalled. Teachers didn't report any authorized pickup. Outside, witnesses remembered seeing an older blue Ford parked by the curb. The man beside it called out to the boy by name, opened the passenger door, and they drove away. No one thought much of it at the time. When Cole hadn't returned home by 5:30, Evelyn began to worry. She phoned the school first. No answer at that hour, then called Martha, who had just finished her hospital shift. Each thought the other had the boy. By 7 p.m., both women realized he was gone. The first call to the Cincinnati Police Department came in at 7:08 that evening. A missing child, 8 years old, last seen near Oak Ridge Elementary. Patrol cars arrived before dark. Officers went door to door, asking the same questions, hearing the same answers. No screams, no signs of a struggle, nothing suspicious. It was as if the boy had been quietly erased between the school gate and the next intersection. By midnight, search teams fanned out along nearby roads and parks, flashlights sweeping through empty fields. Dogs traced scents as far as the bus stop, and then lost the trail. There was no backpack, no shoe, not even a note. The next morning, flyers went up at gas stations, grocery stores, and church notice boards. Cole's face, smiling under a baseball cap, was printed above a single word: missing. Reporters showed up briefly, filmed a few minutes of the search, and moved on to other stories. Evelyn spoke little to anyone. She left the porch light on every night. Martha stayed at the precinct, staring at her son's school photo taped to the investigation board. She told the detectives, in a voice already worn out, "He's afraid of the dark. He wouldn't run away." By the end of the week, no ransom calls had come in, no sightings confirmed. One truck driver reported seeing a blue pickup heading north towards the state highway, but there were no further leads. The detectives began to use the term missing juvenile, which in their language meant they had nothing else to go on. The file for case 89-54142. Raymond, Cole was opened on May 13th, and, by June, already growing thin. Neighbors offered help in the first few days. Then life returned to its usual patterns. Children played outside again, though their parents watched from the porch a little longer. At the Reed house, Cole's room stayed untouched. Bed made, books stacked, the small lamp still on the desk. The school bus drove past every morning at the same hour, and Evelyn would pause for a second at the window before pulling the curtains shut. That summer, the police extended the search radius to the riverbanks, believing perhaps the boy had wandered too far. They found nothing. In their final field report, one officer wrote, "No evidence of foul play. No witness beyond initial sighting. Case remains unresolved." For law enforcement, the trail had ended. For the family, it had only begun. Weeks turned into months. Martha returned to work, quieter than before, carrying a folded flyer in her bag. Evelyn stopped answering most phone calls except those from the detective assigned to her case. The porch light stayed on. People stopped asking questions. From the official standpoint, the file was simple. A boy disappeared without a trace on his way home from school. Yet the real story was less about how he vanished than how easily the world forgot he was gone. And from that Friday afternoon, May 12, 1989, no one ever saw Cole Raymond again. The search for Cole Raymond began the same night he went missing and would continue, in different forms, for the next 3 decades. In 1989, before cell phones, digital cameras, or social media, a missing child case depended entirely on people. Those who looked, those who remembered, and those who cared enough to call. At first, everyone in the small community of Madisonville cared. For the first 72 hours, it felt as if the entire neighborhood was out there with flashlights, calling his name through the dark. Detective Harold Moore, then a 37-year-old investigator with the Cincinnati Police Department, was assigned as lead. He had handled robberies, domestic disputes, and the occasional runaway case, but not a disappearance quite like this. No evidence, no motive, no reason. His first report, dated May 13th, listed the essential facts. 8-year-old male, last seen leaving Oak Ridge Elementary, possibly entering a blue pickup truck. No immediate sign of abduction or injury. Under notes, Moore added one sentence. Family members appear cooperative, but hold conflicting assumptions. Those conflicting assumptions became one of the first obstacles. Martha Lynx believed Cole might have gone off with someone he trusted, perhaps a friend's parent, or even a relative. Evelyn Reed was certain he had been taken by a stranger. Both women were emotional, exhausted, and burdened by guilt. When questioned separately, each admitted they thought the other had picked Cole up early that day. That gap, those crucial few hours of misunderstanding, became the hole where every lead disappeared. By Monday, May 15th, the local police were joined by state troopers and volunteers. Search dogs combed the woods behind the school. Divers checked a section of the Little Miami River. Helicopters flew low over nearby farms. Nothing. A week later, the flyers were sun-bleached on poles and storefronts. The hotline received dozens of calls. A boy seen at a bus depot in Dayton, another near a mall in Lexington, one more outside a diner in Columbus. None of them were Cole. Evelyn answered every call herself. She insisted on seeing the photos, sometimes even drove to nearby towns when someone claimed they'd spotted a small boy alone. Once, she came back at dawn, eyes red, having spent the night outside a shelter that turned out to house another child entirely. "It looked like him," she told Detective Moore, "until it didn't." The investigation shifted focus. If the boy had been taken, who would have a reason? No one in the family had enemies. No ransom note ever arrived. No suspicious cars had been reported near the school before. The teachers said Cole was quiet, but not withdrawn. He had friends, liked drawing maps and collecting baseball cards. He wasn't a troublemaker, and he hadn't been bullied. The absence of motive made the file heavier, not thinner. Around the third week, detectives ran background checks on known offenders within a 10-mile radius. 23 names surfaced, all interviewed, none linked. One man, a mechanic with a prior assault charge, drove a blue truck and became the brief focus of attention. But his truck had been sold months before, and his alibi checked out. The case hit its first dead end. Then came a moment of false hope. A woman in northern Kentucky reported seeing a boy matching Cole's description at a rest area with an older man. The man drove, she said, a blue pickup. Police issued an alert to all state patrols between Ohio and Indiana. Hours later, they found the truck parked outside a gas station. Inside was a father traveling with his son. The boy's name was Brian, not Cole, and he had proof of ID from his school. It was a dead lead, like so many that would follow. In the months that came, the investigation thinned as public attention waned. Cole's case was featured once on local television, a 2-minute segment during the evening news. The anchor used the phrase, "possible runaway," a suggestion that angered Martha but echoed the police's quiet assumption. Cases without evidence of abduction often got reclassified that way. It kept the statistics manageable. Detective Moore, however, never fully accepted that explanation. In his handwritten notes, later recovered from archives, he wrote, "This boy didn't run. He was taken or lost due to circumstance, but he didn't run." He kept a copy of Cole's school photo in his desk drawer. The last recorded sighting of any potential witness came from a gas station clerk who thought he remembered seeing a boy with a bandaged hand buying candy around that same weekend. The description was vague, the timeline uncertain. The station's security system hadn't been working. Again, no verification. By August 1989, the official search was scaled down. The detectives moved to other cases. The hotline stayed open, though fewer calls came. Evelyn continued writing letters, to the governor's office, to news stations, to anyone who would listen. Most went unanswered. Martha, meanwhile, returned to her night shifts, her movements reduced to work and home. When asked by a social worker if she wanted to join a support group for missing children's parents, she declined. "I just want my son back," she said. The case file grew dusty by winter. The police reports, collected and bound, filled one thin folder labeled in red marker. Missing. Raymond Cole, May 1989. Inside were a handful of photographs, witness, statements, and the one map Cole had drawn of his neighborhood, a childish sketch that investigators kept, hoping it meant something. No one knew why he'd drawn a bridge that led to nowhere. Years later, when the file was reviewed, that map would resurface again. But in 1989, it was simply one more piece of paper in a file that had stopped moving. For the record, the final entry of that year read, "Subject still missing. No new evidence. Case remains active pending additional information." In the language of law enforcement, that meant suspended without closure, And so, after months of search parties, interviews, and unanswered questions, the investigation into the disappearance of Cole Raymond quietly faded from headlines and conversation. The city moved on. The streets filled again with the noise of another school year, another cycle of lives. But for Martha and Evelyn, time did not move in the same way. Each night, one left her porch light burning. The other prayed before every shift that a phone call might come. It never did. Cole Raymond had vanished, and with him went the certainty that ordinary places were safe. Time has a way of dulling public memory, but not the kind that belongs to mothers. For Martha Lynx, 1989 never truly ended. Every May, when the air in Cincinnati grew warm and heavy again, she would feel the same quiet ache in her chest, the same question that had never been answered. Where was her boy? She aged, but the question didn't. It simply settled into her voice, her posture, the way she hesitated at the sight of school buses passing by. The following years brought silence. By 1991, Cole Raymond's name appeared on the National Missing Children's Registry, listed without updates. The photograph used was still the same. An 8-year-old boy smiling shyly, one front tooth missing. The local police had nothing new to offer. Detective Harold Moore was transferred to another department, and the case, labeled inactive but not closed, was moved to storage. The cardboard box that held Cole's file was stamped with the words, "Cold Case, Juvenile Missing." Inside were only a few pieces of paper and a map drawn by a child who might have been trying to remember his own world. Evelyn Reed continued to live in the same house where Cole had stayed, though the walls seemed to tighten around her with each passing year. The boys' room remained untouched. She dusted the desk every Sunday, refilled the air freshener, and once a year washed the curtains, even though no one had opened those windows since 1989. Neighbors eventually stopped asking. Some of them moved away. Others, out of politeness, avoided the subject altogether. In their eyes, Evelyn had become part of the house. Quiet, fixed, unchanging. In 1995, Martha appeared on a local radio segment called Voices of the Missing. The host, a woman with a soothing tone, asked her how she had managed all these years. Martha replied simply, "You don't manage it, you just keep breathing." Her words lingered, but for most listeners, she was just another name among hundreds of parents still searching for someone. When the show ended, she went home, placed the radio on the table, and sat in silence. That was the last time she spoke publicly about her son. By the late 1990s, technology had begun to change how police handled disappearances, but older cases like Cole's rarely benefited. DNA databases were new, slow, and incomplete. Fingerprints from missing minors had to be manually compared, and only if another agency sent in a match. Most of the time, there was nothing to compare. Cole's DNA, taken from a strand of hair his mother saved, was entered into the system in 1998. But for more than 20 years, it would sit there without a single hit. The old detective, Harold Moore, retired in 2002. On his last day, he went through a drawer of unresolved files and paused at Cole's folder. He held the photo one more time, the boy's dark eyes, the half-smile, and wrote a short note before returning it to storage. If found, notify Link's family immediately. It was a small act, but it kept the file from being archived as abandoned. For Martha, the years after retirement from nursing were slow and routine. She moved to a smaller apartment, joined a church group, and volunteered at a shelter twice a week. She told few people about her son, though some noticed the framed photo she always carried when she changed homes. "My boy," she would say when asked, her tone neither hopeful nor defeated. Still missing. Evelyn, on the other hand, never stopped writing letters. Between 2005 and 2020, she sent nearly 100 of them, to state offices, TV stations, even federal agencies, each ending with the same plea: If there's any way to reopen the case, please do. For a long time, no one did. It wasn't until the spring of 2022 that something shifted. Ohio's Department of Public Safety announced a new program dedicated to revisiting long-term missing persons, cases older than 20 years that had never been solved or officially closed. They called it the Long-Term Missing Initiative. The project combined new DNA technology with digitized archives, allowing cross-matching between hospitals, shelters, and unidentified persons. To most families, it sounded like another bureaucratic announcement. But to Evelyn Reed, it was a door that had been locked for too long. She contacted the office immediately, attaching scanned copies of the original police report and her nephew's photograph. Within 2 weeks, she received a call from a young investigator named Sergeant Lisa McHale, who confirmed that Cole's case had been located in the archives, still active, still waiting. It was the first time in 33 years that someone from law enforcement had spoken his name officially. Evelyn drove to the precinct in person, bringing with her a small envelope she had kept for decades. Inside were 3 items, one of Cole's pencils, a hand-drawn map, and a single strand of hair taped to an old index card. It was from the last haircut she'd given him, the week before he disappeared. "If DNA can do something," she told the sergeant, "use this." McHale assured her they would. Meanwhile, Martha received the news with cautious disbelief. "They've said things before," she told a neighbor. "I'll believe it when someone knocks on my door." Still, she agreed to provide a blood sample for comparison. It was taken in her living room by a mobile technician, her hands trembling slightly as the needle pierced her arm. 36 years, she whispered. "That's a long time to wait for proof your child existed." By summer 2022, the old file of Cole Raymond had been fully digitized and entered into the state's new DNA system. It became one of 487 unsolved missing child cases flagged for review. Most led nowhere, records lost, samples degraded, no matches found. But for Cole, the strand of hair Evelyn had saved was still viable. The system logged his genetic profile into the database under reference ID CR 1989-1052. And then, somewhere in a lab outside Columbus, a small red icon appeared next to that ID. Partial match detected. At that moment, in a sterile room filled with humming machines, the silence that had lasted 3 decades began to shift. It wasn't an answer yet, only a sign. A pulse from a life the world had long assumed was gone. The technicians double-checked the data, confirmed the sequence, and forwarded the results to the long-term missing division. A report was printed the next morning, stamped confidential. It contained 5 words that would soon reopen everything. Possible DNA link, Cleveland area. For the first time since 1989, the search for Cole Raymond had movement again. But no one could yet imagine where it would lead, or what they were about to find after 36 years of silence. The report that arrived on Sergeant Lisa McHale's desk in late 2022 was short, barely 2 pages, but it carried the weight of 3 decades. The Ohio State Forensic Lab had found a genetic overlap between the DNA sample labeled Cole Raymond, missing 1989, and a man living under state guardianship in Cleveland. The match rate was 99.87%. In other words, almost certain. Yet the description that came with it did not match the boy anyone remembered. The man was 41 years old, listed as a resident with limited memory function in a long-term care facility run by the county. He went by another name, Ray Collins. At first, McHale assumed it was an error. Cases like this had produced false positives before. Mix-ups between relatives, corrupted samples, mislabeled data. But when she read the file more carefully, something caught her attention. The man's records began in 1990, only a year after Cole's disappearance. No birth certificate, No prior identification, only a notation that he had been admitted to a juvenile shelter as an unaccompanied minor, approximately 9 to 10 years old. Mikhail requested the archived intake forms. The handwriting was faded, but one detail stood out. Under remarks, the intake worker had written, "Child found wandering near train yard, disoriented, gives inconsistent name." The boy had been placed temporarily in a shelter, given the name Ray Collins, after the social worker who processed him, and eventually transferred to a group home when no family came forward. His photo from that time showed a small face with wide-set eyes, hair trimmed short, a bruise just visible near the left temple. The resemblance to Cole's school picture was undeniable. When Mikhail took the findings to her supervisor, he frowned and leaned back in his chair. "So you're saying the kid never left the state," he said. "All this time, and he was in the system?" Mikhail nodded. "Looks that way." "Then find him," the man said, "and make sure we're not about to tell a family the wrong story." In January 2023, 2 investigators from the Long-Term Missing Division drove north to Cleveland. The facility was an old brick building once used as a convent, now converted into a residential care center for adults with partial cognitive impairment. They met with the director, who told them that Ray had lived there for more than 20 years. "He's quiet," she said. "Keeps to himself, likes routine, doesn't talk much about the past. We've always assumed he grew up in foster care somewhere and lost contact." When the investigators met him, the man sitting by the window looked older than 41. His hair was thinning, his face pale, but his eyes were alert. He greeted them politely, asked if they were from social services. When they mentioned the name Cole Raymond, he tilted his head slightly, as if the sound tugged at something deep inside but couldn't quite reach it. "I don't know that name," he said slowly. "Should I?" They didn't answer. Instead, they asked if he would be willing to provide a saliva sample for identity confirmation. He agreed, curious but calm. "People come here sometimes," he said, "trying to figure out who I am. I guess you're the next ones." Back in Columbus, the DNA test confirmed what the partial match had already suggested. Ray Collins was Cole Raymond, missing since May 12, 1989. The report was sealed, verified, and logged into the national system. Sergeant Mikhail made the call herself. Martha Lynx was in her small apartment when the phone rang. It had been years since any officer had called her about her son. The voice on the other end was gentle but direct. "Mrs. Lynx, we believe we've located your son." There was a silence before she answered. "You believe?" she repeated quietly. "Or you know?" Mikhail hesitated, then said, "We know." The following days were a blur of preparation, paperwork, and verification. Old photographs were compared. Facial recognition confirmed the structural match. The scar on Cole's left knee, recorded in his childhood medical file, matched one on the man's leg. There was no longer any doubt. What remained was a question far harder to answer. What had happened during those missing years, and why couldn't he remember? Investigators pieced together fragments from public records. The boy had been found wandering near a freight yard outside Cleveland in late summer 1990, dirty, underfed, and without any identification. When asked his name, he reportedly gave 2 different answers, neither of them clear. "Ray," one worker recalled him saying. "Ray, something." Believing he had been abandoned, the system processed him through child welfare as an unknown minor. With no missing person report connected to his case, since Cole's file was then categorized under a different county, the connection was never made. Cole, now Ray, attended a few years of schooling within the group home system, then transferred to a care facility after a series of behavioral evaluations labeled him as developmentally delayed. But the truth, the later doctors suggested, was different. He suffered from traumatic memory suppression, a form of amnesia often triggered by extreme stress in early childhood. No one had ever asked what caused it. When the story reached the chief investigator, he wrote in his report, "Not an abduction, not a runaway, a lost child misfiled by time." Still, questions remained. How did Cole end up 250 miles from Cincinnati? Why was there no search notice circulated in Cleveland? And who, if anyone, had driven that blue truck people saw outside Oak Ridge Elementary? McHale reopened those parts of the file. The original witness statements were reviewed again. No new suspect emerged. The truck was never traced. By spring 2023, the investigation shifted from criminal inquiry to reunification planning. Cole, still known legally as Ray, was informed of his true identity. The first time he saw his childhood photo, he stared for a long time. "That's me," he asked. The investigators nodded. "You went missing when you were 8. He touched the photo, eyes narrowing, searching for recognition that refused to come. 8, he said softly. "That's a long time ago." Meanwhile, Evelyn Reed was told the news in person. The officer who came to her house later said she didn't speak for nearly a minute, just sat back in her chair, eyes filling but unblinking. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. He was here all along. The first meeting was arranged for April 2025, after months of evaluation and counseling for both sides. Martha Lynx was 81 now, her hands frail, her voice softer. She arrived at the facility accompanied by a social worker. In a small meeting room, sunlight filtered through a curtain, illuminating the table where she sat, waiting. Cole entered quietly, hesitating by the doorway, unsure what to feel. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Martha stood, reached out, and said his name, not the new one, but the old one. Cole. Something in the way she said it cut through the fog that had settled over his memory. He didn't remember the school, or the blue truck, or even the old house in Madisonville. But he remembered that voice, the warmth in it. His eyes filled before he even knew why. When she took his hand, he didn't pull away. Outside the door, Sergeant McHale closed the file on her clipboard. The case that had begun with a missing boy was now ending with a man found, not rescued, not restored, but returned. The paperwork would take months, the healing much longer. But for the first time in 36 years, the file no longer read missing. It read located. When the paperwork changed from missing to located, the investigation didn't stop. It only changed direction. Now, instead of searching for a boy, the detectives were searching for an explanation, something that could bridge the gap between 1989 and 1990, between Cincinnati and Cleveland, between the child who vanished and the man who reappeared without a past. Sergeant Lisa McHale and her small team began by reconstructing the final days before Cole Raymond disappeared. The case files had aged like old paper, yellowed, smudged, but still holding the same cold questions. The school reports, the witness statements, the hand-drawn map, everything was re-examined. They followed every line of movement from that day, every call that had been logged, every potential route that led out of Madisonville. The data showed what they already knew. A child left school, entered a blue pickup, and was never seen again. But the real mystery began after that moment, not where he went, but why no one ever found him when he was, in fact, still alive and in the same state. McHale requested all archived juvenile welfare records from 1989 to 1992. It took weeks for the boxes to arrive, dusty and unmarked, from a warehouse on the edge of Columbus. Inside one of them was a logbook from a children's shelter in Cleveland. Its pages were water-stained, handwritten in blue ink. Entry number 247 read, "Male child, approx. 9 years old, found near rail yard, no ID, gives inconsistent name. Admitted 8/1990. The intake officer's initials matched the name Collins, the man who would later become Ray's namesake, but one line written in the margin stopped her. Says he came from by the bridge, frightened of trucks, flinches at loud noises. That note, buried in a forgotten record, offered the first human clue to what might have happened. The boy had mentioned a bridge, something that had appeared curiously in the map Cole drew before he vanished. A bridge that led nowhere. Investigators compared it to an old overpass near the southern rail line outside Cincinnati, a place kids sometimes played, not far, from where witnesses saw the blue truck. It was possible that Cole had wandered there, been picked up, or simply gotten lost and followed the wrong road north. The distance between Cincinnati and Cleveland was over 200 miles, impossible for an 8-year-old to cover alone. So the remaining question, the only one that still mattered, was who took him there. Detective Moore, now retired but still following the case from home, was asked to review the new findings. He read the reports with slow care, the way old detectives read the past, not looking for villains anymore, just patterns. "That bridge," he said to McHale when they spoke by phone, "it's not a metaphor. Kids remember things they see." He drew what frightened him. Moore believed Cole might have been taken north by someone who worked along the interstate. A trucker, a rail worker, someone transient. In 1989, records of such movement were rarely kept. The man could have dropped him off near Cleveland, intending to find help or simply to leave him behind. The theory was impossible to prove, but consistent with what little evidence remained. The trauma, the memory loss, the absence of abuse markers. It all pointed to a short, chaotic event rather than a prolonged captivity. Something happened that erased more than a year of Cole's young life, leaving only fragments too faint to surface. When McHale interviewed Cole in the care facility later that year, she didn't ask direct questions about 1989. Instead, she spoke of sounds, smells, and feelings. He didn't remember names, but he remembered the sound of water under a bridge, the smell of gasoline, and a man's voice, kind but hurried. When she showed him the map he'd drawn as a child, his hand trembled slightly. "That's where I used to walk," he murmured. "I think I got scared." Then he stopped speaking, as if the act of remembering itself hurt. Psychologists confirmed what the investigators had already begun to understand. Cole's memory loss was not deliberate, but protective. The mind had sealed away the events of that time. Opening it might never be possible. What mattered more now was rebuilding a sense of identity for the man he had become. Meanwhile, the state began the process of restoring his legal name. Ray Collins would remain in some records, but for all official purposes, he was again Cole Raymond. Reporters caught wind of the story, calling it "the boy who came back after 36 years." But the police released few details. McHale's only statement to the press was brief. "This is not a story about crime. It's a story about connection, about what can be found when nothing is left to find." In May 2025, the Ohio State Missing Persons Unit held a small closed-door briefing marking the official resolution of Case 89-5142. McHale stood before a group of officers, some not yet born when the boy first vanished. On the table was a single folder, thin, but heavier in meaning than any stack of files. 36 years, she said, her voice even. A case like this reminds us that not every investigation ends with a conviction. Sometimes, it ends with a face. After the meeting, she delivered the file personally to Martha Lynx. It was late afternoon, sunlight coming in through the blinds of the small living room. The elderly woman sat in her armchair, hands clasped over her knees. McHale placed the file on the table. "It's officially closed now, Mrs. Lynx," she said. "You can keep this." Martha opened it slowly. Inside were the photos from 1989 and one from the present, the boy and the man side by side. Her eyes lingered on them for a long time. "He looks tired," she said softly. McHale nodded. "He's had a long journey." That night, for the first time in 36 years, the porch light outside Martha's apartment was turned off. Not because she had given up hope, but because she no longer needed it to guide anyone home. In her final written statement to the investigators, she added a single line at the bottom, beneath her signature. "He didn't come back the same, but he came back. That's enough." For the police, that was the final page. For the family, it was the beginning of another chapter, one without mystery, but not without ghosts. And for the record, the official conclusion entered into the state database read, Case 89-5142, status resolved, subject located alive, cause of disappearance undetermined. The truth, as far as the law was concerned, was complete. The rest, the fear, the loss, the blank years, would remain unrecorded, living only in the silence between a mother and her son who were learning, once again, how to recognize each other. When a missing child is found after decades, people expect a villain, a confession, a headline that closes the circle. But Cole Raymond's story offered none of those things. There was no kidnapper hiding in the dark, no crime to punish. Only the long, simple failure of a system that had misplaced a child. The state's review called it administrative fragmentation. In 1989, missing children's files were stored by county, not state. Cole disappeared from Cincinnati, Hamilton County, but was found a year later in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County. Back then, there was no shared database, no DNA registry, and no one to compare the two names. A paper wall had separated a lost boy from his own family. For Detective Harold Moore, now an old man, that truth hurt more than any arrest ever could. "We didn't lose him to crime," he said quietly. "We lost him to paperwork." His note to the investigators was simple. "You did what we couldn't. Thank you." Martha Lynx didn't want justice in the courtroom sense. "No one took him to hurt him," she told a reporter. "He was a child who fell through the cracks." When she spoke those words, she didn't sound angry, just tired, as if the waiting itself had been the only punishment that mattered. The investigation tried to trace how Cole reached Cleveland. The likeliest theory was that a passing truck driver picked him up near the bridge he had drawn in his map, frightened and lost, and dropped him at a rail yard thinking he'd be helped. That man's name, if it ever existed in a file, was long gone. The state acknowledged its part. A quiet press release from the Department of Human Services admitted that systemic communication failures had led to a preventable separation. It wasn't an apology, but it was something close. Cole, now learning how to live again under his real name, didn't ask for explanations. "I was lost once," he said during one therapy session. "Now I'm not. That's enough." When his legal identity was restored in July 2025, the judge asked if he wished to say anything. Cole shook his head, then added softly, "Just keep my name as it was." In the courtroom, Martha smiled through tears that had waited 36 years to fall. Outside, the world moved on. No cameras, no applause, no villains to name. Only a line added to the state database. Case 89-5142, resolved. Subject located alive. It wasn't justice in the way people imagined, but it was the kind that matters most. The quiet correction of something that should never have gone wrong. By the winter of 2025, The name Cole Raymond had already slipped out of the headlines. The newspapers had moved on. Television stations found new stories to chase, and the brief moment of national attention, the boy who came home after 36 years, had dissolved into another headline archived somewhere online. But for the people who had carried his absence for more than half their lives, the story didn't end with that discovery. It lingered, quiet and persistent, like a sound only a few could still hear. Cole now lived in Dayton, in a small apartment maintained through the state's transitional housing program. The building was plain, beige bricks, 3 floors, a place for people learning how to live again. He worked part-time at a maintenance garage, cleaning tools, organizing supplies, and fixing small mechanical parts. It wasn't much, but it was something solid, something that stayed the same from day to day. Routine, his doctors said, was the foundation of healing. Most of his days were quiet. He woke early, drank coffee in silence, then walked to the garage by 8. He preferred small tasks, ones that kept his hands busy and his mind steady. Every Thursday evening, he attended therapy sessions. Sometimes he spoke about the missing years, though the memories still came only in fragments, never as stories, only flashes. A stretch of highway under gray sky, the smell of rain and oil. A man's voice saying, "You'll be fine, kid." Then nothing. The rest of his life had filled that space, building over it like layers of paint. When asked if he wished to recover those memories, Cole always hesitated. "I don't know," he'd say. "Some things might not need remembering." He had learned to live without the past, to let the present carry what was left of it. Martha Lynx visited him every Sunday, traveling 2 hours from Cincinnati by bus. She was 81 now, her movements slower, her voice softer, but she never missed a week. She always brought something small, a jar of soup, clean socks, a new shirt. Sometimes she brought old photos, though she had learned not to press him to remember. They would sit by the window, the TV on low, talking about nothing important. The weather, the bus routes, a neighbor's dog. The silence between them was gentle now, not heavy. One afternoon, she asked if he wanted to visit the old neighborhood. He looked uncertain. "Maybe," he said. "Someday." When she left that evening, she touched his shoulder, the same way she had when he was a boy. "You're home now, Cole," she whispered. "That's all that matters." In the spring, Evelyn Reed sold her house in Madisonville. The place had stood almost frozen since 1989. The same curtains, the same pictures, the same porch light that had burned through countless nights. Before leaving, she went into Cole's old room one last time. The air smelled faintly of dust and cedar. On the desk was the pencil with the blue eraser and the small hand-drawn map he had made, the one showing a bridge that led to nowhere. She folded it carefully, placed it inside a wooden box, and closed the door behind her. When the moving truck pulled away, the porch light stayed off for the first time in 36 years. "He doesn't need it anymore," she said to the neighbor watching from across the street. That same month, Detective Harold Moore passed away in his sleep. He was 73. Among his belongings, his daughter found an old police folder labeled Raymond Cole, 1989. Inside were copies of the first missing persons bulletin and a note in his handwriting. "Some cases don't end. They just come home in another form." The folder was delivered to the Cincinnati Police Department, where it now sits in a glass cabinet dedicated to unsolved cases, except this one, finally, has the word "resolved" written beside it. Sergeant Lisa McHale, the officer who had reopened the investigation, continued her work at the long-term missing division. She rarely gave interviews, though she was invited to speak at several conferences about the use of DNA in cold cases. Her remarks were always brief. Technology helped us find him, but what truly solved it was persistence, the belief that no case is too old to matter. After each talk, she returned to her desk and reopened another forgotten file. Cole himself rarely spoke to anyone about what had happened. Reporters tried to reach him after the reunion, but he declined all requests. "It's not a story for television," he told McHale once. "It's just a life that got lost for a while." He kept a small framed photo of his mother on the table by the window, and sometimes, on quiet nights, looked at it for a long time before turning out the light. The world around them continued as it always does. Fast, indifferent, filled with new stories and new absences. But in the small spaces where memory still lived, the people closest to Cole carried something like peace. Evelyn moved into a retirement community near the coast. Martha stayed in Cincinnati, keeping her son's letters in a drawer. Every December, she wrote him a birthday card in careful handwriting. "To my boy who came home." In her last recorded interview, a journalist asked Martha what lesson she thought people should take from her story. She thought for a long moment before answering. "That we don't really lose the people we love," she said. "Sometimes they just get misplaced, like a photograph that slips between the pages of a book. One day you open it again, and there they are, older, changed, but still yours." The camera lingered on her face as she smiled faintly, her eyes distant but calm. Behind her, the late afternoon sun fell across the room, warm and steady. In the archives of the Ohio State Missing Persons Unit, the file labeled Case 89-5142, Raymond, Cole now bears a final stamp in red ink. Located 2025. Case closed. The box rests on a shelf among thousands of others, a small reminder that justice sometimes comes not as a verdict, but as a return. And somewhere in Dayton, a man once lost to time still wakes before dawn, makes coffee, and stands by the window watching the first light spread over the street. The world moves quietly, as if nothing extraordinary ever happened. But for the ones who remained, the mother, the aunt, the detectives, the light that was left on for him has never truly gone out. If you want to hear more real-life disappearance cases reopened after decades, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Every share helps keep these stories alive, and maybe, somewhere out there, helps one missing person find their way home.